Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into a case that's really both fascinating and disturbing and kind of hits close to home for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, for
The
sure.
Unsolved Golden Years murders in Richmond, Virginia.
Between 1990 and 1996, at least 13 elderly women, all living alone, were killed. And, as you said, it's a case that I think has a lot of elements that would really resonate with people because it speaks to that vulnerability of aging
Right.
and, just the idea that someone could be preying on a population that's already, maybe not as able to defend themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this case so intriguing, and I think why it's remained unsolved for so long, is that it really does seem like there are strong indicators that point to a serial killer.
Yeah.
We've got the similar victim profiles, the locations, but then there are also these inconsistencies that make it really hard to say definitively, was this one person
Right.
or were there multiple people involved?
And then, of course, we have the figure of Leslie Burchart,
Right.
who confessed to 4 of the murders, but later recanted his confession. So was he truly the culprit, or was there something else going on? Or was he partially involved?
Right.
It's just a very tangled web.
Yeah, and before we get into all the twists and turns of Burchart and his involvement and the kind of the controversy surrounding that, I think it's important to just start with what we know
Yeah,
for certain.
absolutely.
So let's lay out the kind of the basic facts of the case.
Right,
All 13 victims were women,
right.
ranging in age from 55 to 89, all of them living alone.
Yes.
And this is where it starts to get really interesting.
Okay.
The first 6 victims, all of whom were black, were stabbed.
Uh-huh.
But then the next 7 victims, who were all white, the method changed to strangulation.
Yeah, that's a really significant detail, and it's one that investigators have really grappled with over the years.
I mean, that's a huge shift in modus operandi,
Right.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
did investigators at the time consider the possibility that maybe there was more than one killer at work?
I mean, they definitely considered it. I mean, you can't ignore a change like that, right? It just begs the question, was this one individual who, for some reason decided to change their tactics,
Right.
or were there actually multiple perpetrators operating, within Richmond during that time?
What's so scary about this case is that it it took place over such a long period of time. I mean, we're talking 6 years
Yeah.
that these murders were happening.
Mm.
And so for the people living in Richmond, particularly elderly women living alone,
Right.
they must have just been living in absolute terror.
Absolutely. I mean,
mean,
the climate of fear in the city was palpable.
Yeah.
I mean, gun sales skyrocketed. People were installing extra locks on their doors.
Yeah.
Getting watchdog. I mean, it wasn't just paranoia. It was a very real threat, and people were reacting accordingly.
And it really speaks to that sense of vulnerability that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That, this population that's already, perhaps not as, physically strong or able to defend themselves,
Right.
is being targeted.
Targeted and feeling like they can't even trust their own homes,
Right.
their own neighborhoods.
So let's talk about this prime suspect, Leslie Burchart.
Okay.
How did he come onto the radar of investigators?
So Burchart was a homeless man
Okay.
struggling with mental illness who was living on the streets of Richmond during the time of the murders.
Okay.
His initial arrest in 1996 was actually for trespassing.
Oh.
It seemingly had nothing to do with the Golden Years cases, but
Mhm.
then he confessed to killing 3 homeless men.
Oh, wow. So he's already admitting to multiple murders,
Right.
and that obviously landed him a life sentence.
Yeah.
So at this point, you might think, okay, case closed, right?
Yeah, you'd think so.
But it's not that simple.
No, it's not, because 3 years later, in 1999,
Okay.
Burchart dropped this bombshell. He confessed to 4 of the Golden Years murders.
Whoa.
And what's even more striking is that he provided specific details about the crime scenes, things that supposedly only the investigators would have known.
So he's already in prison,
Right.
serving a life sentence for other murders.
Yeah.
And then out of nowhere, he decides to confess to these additional killings.
It's a very strange turn of events.
I mean, what was his motive for doing that?
It's unclear. His motives were never entirely clear.
Right.
Some people speculated that he was seeking notoriety
Oh,
or maybe trying to bargain for better conditions in prison.
Sure.
But, we don't really know for sure.
so if his confessions were so detailed,
Yeah.
why wasn't he ever tried for the Golden Years murders?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
Because despite those chilling specifics that he offered, there was no physical evidence
Oh, wow.
linking him to the crime scenes.
Okay.
And without that, prosecutors just couldn't build a strong enough case to bring him to trial for those specific murders.
So we've got a man confessing to these horrific crimes,
But
but no forensic evidence to back up his claims.
yeah, it's a real head scratcher.
Yeah.
And then just when you think it can't get any more convoluted, oh no.
There's another twist. In 2002, shortly before his death, Burchart recanted his confessions.
Oh wow, so now he's saying he's innocent.
Yes, proclaiming his innocence.
I mean, was he telling the truth initially and then changed his mind? Was he pressured into confessing? Or was he never involved at all?
It's impossible to know for sure.
Yeah.
And it's a question that, continues to fuel debate among those who've studied the case.
Right. And I think it's also important to consider that Burchart was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that raises questions about, the reliability of his statements.
Right.
Could his mental illness have led to false memories
Yeah.
or, a distorted perception of reality?
That's a huge question mark hanging over the entire case.
Yeah. So we're really left wondering, were these confessions genuine admissions of guilt that were later retracted for some unknown reason?
Right.
Or were they a product of his illness?
And if so, what does that mean for the investigation as a whole?
Right, exactly. It's a real puzzle.
It is a puzzle. Yeah, and one that we're going to try to unpack a little bit further.
Absolutely. Yeah, a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces, for sure. And it brings up, I think, some really important questions about how we handle cases involving a mental illness, within the criminal justice system. How do we determine the competency of someone like Burchart to confess? Was there any coercion involved? Could his schizophrenia have led to, false memories, a distorted perception of reality?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point. That it's not just about solving, this particular crime, but it's also about ensuring that our justice system operates fairly and ethically,
Right.
especially when we're dealing with people who may be more vulnerable.
Absolutely. And then there's another layer to this case that we need to talk about: the racial dynamics. Remember that shift in the killer's MO? The first 6 victims were black and they were stabbed, and the next 7 were white and they were strangled.
Right.
And that raises some really uncomfortable questions about whether there was, a difference in the urgency or the focus of the investigation based on the race of the victims.
It's a chilling thought. Was it possible that the lives of those first 6 black women were somehow seen as less valuable, their murders less deserving of attention?
I mean, that's a question that has been raised by many people who have followed this case. And it's a question that I think needs to be addressed even all these years later.
It's a reminder that justice is not always blind, and we really need to scrutinize our systems to make sure that they're serving everyone equally.
100%. But, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what a thorough reinvestigation of the Golden Years murders might look like today. We have so many tools and techniques now that weren't available back in the 90s.
Yeah, what could we do differently?
Well, DNA technology has obviously come a long way.
Right.
We could re-examine any available physical evidence. Even the tiniest traces could potentially yield DNA profiles that were impossible to obtain back then.
Yeah, and even if we don't find Burchart's DNA, it could still be incredibly valuable because it could exclude him as a suspect in some of the murders, or it could even point to someone completely new.
Exactly. And we can leverage, the power of modern investigative databases and data analysis techniques. We could re-examine all of the existing evidence, look for patterns, connections that might have been missed before.
Yeah, could we compare the Golden Years murders to other unsolved homicides, maybe not just in Richmond, but, nationwide?
Yeah, absolutely. And today's technology allows us to do that.
Yeah.
We can analyze vast amounts of data quickly and efficiently, and we might be able to see links that were invisible to investigators, back then.
What about behavioral analysis, criminal profiling?
Yeah.
Could experts study, the crime scenes, the victim selection, the methods used to build like a more detailed profile of the perpetrator?
I think that would be a really valuable tool.
Right.
And, while profiling isn't foolproof, obviously, it can provide really valuable insights that can help investigators narrow down suspects, develop interview strategies, even predict future behavior.
What about witness testimony? Is there a chance that someone out there has information that's relevant to the case, but they were never interviewed or their story was dismissed?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Memories can fade, but sometimes a fresh perspective, a new line of questioning can trigger a recollection that was buried or overlooked.
And, given the fear that gripped Richmond at the time, It's easy to imagine that some people might have been hesitant to come forward,
Absolutely.
afraid of retaliation or just, not wanting to get involved.
And I think a reinvestigation could provide a safe and supportive space for those individuals to share what they know. They might have information that they didn't even realize was important back then.
And we've also got to consider, time has passed, relationships change, loyalties shift.
Yeah.
Someone who might have been reluctant to speak up years ago,
Mm.
might now feel compelled to come forward.
Yeah, we see that all the time with cold cases. That one piece of information, that one seemingly insignificant detail could be the key to unlocking the truth.
And let's not forget about the power of the public.
Right.
A renewed focus on this case media attention, a dedicated tip line. These things can really encourage people to come forward with information that they might not have thought was relevant.
Absolutely. And it's amazing what can happen when a community really rallies together to seek justice. Sometimes all it takes is one person, one memory, one tiny clue to break a case wide open.
So a reinvestigation of the Golden Years murders using, all of the tools and approaches that we have available to us today
Right.
could uncover new DNA evidence. It could reveal hidden connections in the data. It could provide a more accurate profile of the killer or killers. And it could also bring forth new witnesses and engage the public in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
It is a lot of possibilities. But, some people might still ask, is it really possible to solve a case this old?
Right.
A case that's been cold for, nearly 3 decades?
It's a fair question. But, the families of these victims deserve answers.
Right.
And the community deserves closure.
For sure.
And if there's even the slightest chance that we can bring the perpetrator to justice, shouldn't we try?
Absolutely. And we've seen it happen before. Cold cases once thought unsolvable are being cracked open all the time, thanks to, advances in technology and investigative techniques. It might be a long shot, but I think it's a shot worth taking.
It's easy to get really caught up in, the forensics and the investigation and all that.
Yeah.
But we're talking about real people here.
Yeah.
13 women, all in their golden years, and they were robbed of their futures.
And it's important to remember the impact that these murders had, not just on the victims' families, but on the whole community.
Right.
I mean, imagine living in Richmond during that time and just the constant fear, the uncertainty. It's a wound that takes a long time to heal.
And I think this case really forces us to confront, a harsh reality, which is the vulnerability of our elderly population.
Yeah.
These were individuals who, in many cases, lived alone, relied on others for support. Might not have been as physically capable of defending themselves. I mean, they were easy targets.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder, what can we do as a society to better protect, our senior citizens? How can we create communities where they feel safe and supported and valued?
Yeah. I mean, it's about, fostering that culture of respect and awareness, making sure they have access to the resources they need, and just being vigilant about, their well-being.
Absolutely. Checking in on your neighbors.
Yeah.
The elderly people in your life, reporting any signs of abuse or neglect. We all have a role to play in making sure that our senior citizens can live out their golden years in peace and dignity.
Yeah. Well said. So going back to the Golden Years murders you mentioned earlier, some of the limitations of our criminal justice system, particularly when dealing with suspects who are mentally ill. And Burchardt's case really highlights those challenges, doesn't it?
It really does. His confessions, the recantations, his schizophrenia diagnosis, it just raises so many questions about competency coercion and the reliability of statements made by people struggling with mental health issues.
So how do we navigate that?
Yeah.
How do we balance the need to solve crimes with the need to treat everyone fairly and humanely, no matter their mental state?
It's a tough question. We need to make sure that, law enforcement is trained to recognize and handle those situations appropriately. We need adequate mental health resources available both within the justice system and in the community.
And we need to be really mindful of the potential for false confessions.
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with vulnerable people who might be easily manipulated.
For sure.
Or confused.
It's about approaching each case with sensitivity and understanding.
Yeah.
And recognizing that, mental illness can play a huge role in a person's actions and their statements.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and I got to say, I'm still left with so many questions.
I hear that.
Was Burchard responsible for any or all of these murders?
Yeah.
Were there other killers in Richmond at the time? And did racial bias play a role in how these cases were investigated?
These are questions that are probably going to continue to haunt this case for a long time.
Yeah.
And, we may never have definitive answers, but the search for truth and justice is a process.
Right.
And even cold cases can yield new insights with fresh perspectives and new technologies.
And I think beyond just, the specifics of this case, the Golden Years murders are a really powerful reminder of the importance of community, vigilance, empathy.
Hmm?
We need to look out for one another,
For sure.
especially those who are most vulnerable. We need to speak up when we see injustice, and we need to never stop demanding answers and accountability.
Well said. The Golden Years murders may be a cold case, but the lessons we can learn from it are really timeless and important. Let's honor the memory of those lost by striving to create a safer and more just and compassionate society for everyone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it sparked your curiosity, challenged some assumptions, and maybe gave you something to think about long after this episode is over.